Morning, morning. Welcome to day 2. I don't know about you all, but I thought yesterday went fairly well and was absolutely fascinating. I ran off a checklist of small lessons learned and observations from the Wolfpack competition that were embedded in the comments of all the pitches, and I was just absolutely impressed by all of the companies that competed, and there's so many really powerful lessons in what they've accomplished so far. I think a couple of these are really worth taking note of. One, what you're seeing, because innovation has this myth around it that is cast of thousands and huge expense budgets, really what you saw yesterday is the power of what 2 or 3 people on a team can do together, and how fast you can move and go to market. Now, you all understand something that most startups can't really internalize or hope to comprehend at this point, and that is scale. So one of the reasons that insurtechs have enjoyed such a greater success rate than in the startup world, as opposed to typical venture capital, Silicon Valley kind of model, is because insurers do bring a mentoring, an adoption, and a broader range of support to the companies that they align with or invest in. And as a result, that knowledge of scale kind of comes out. But what you saw were the power of small teams committed to a single idea, working with a laser-like focus and not having the distractions that get in the way of so many incumbent cultures. And then also the power of collaboration and adaptability, I thought came through really clearly in their presentations and pitches in a way that everybody can kind of think about and maybe take back to your own corporate innovation work. It's my pleasure this morning to kick us off with the first panel. And with that, I'll bring up Keegan, who is a partner at PwC. And let's give a round to PwC also for the great breakfast this morning. Thank that. Great way to fuel the engine before we get the day started. Keegan, come on up, and I'll let you introduce your panel.
We'll get the panel up as well with me here, so we don't have to do an awkward one-by-one across the stage. Good morning. Thanks, everyone, for having us. We're going to talk a little bit about integration with incumbents. And so we've got an esteemed panel I'll introduce in a moment, but effectively, I think our thesis is that innovation and disruption, as I think we heard yesterday, the pace of change, the scale of that change, and the appetite, I think now, for that change have all evolved very significantly over the last few years. So we want to explore some of the themes around how that's worked, what could go better, and also sort of where to from here. And so that's what we're going to touch on a little bit today. I think just by way of introduction, with me today, I was going to say I have them in alphabetical order, but we didn't sit that way, so you'll bear with me, is Jocelyn, who's a VP of Digital Transformation and Operational Excellence at Desjardins Insurance Group. He's responsible for the digital and innovation strategies and delivers, he's also in that respect in charge of the relationship with insurtechs. So thank you, Jocelyn, for joining us. With us as well is Phil Martin, actually now sitting beside Jocelyn, which is great. Phil is the Director of Business Development at Trove, one of our startups here. He's responsible for driving growth, revenue with a primary focus on the North American market. And prior to joining Trove, Phil's with Hewlett Packard Enterprises, where he managed consulting, transformation, and analytics programs. So thank you, Phil, for being here. We also have Mayor Amar with us, who's a managing partner with Impression Ventures, a VC firm focused on investing in early-stage fintech businesses looking to modernize the global financial industry. And prior to being at Impression Ventures, Mayor was the global capital markets business and 20 years in the cap market space. So we've got a very, I think, hopefully different set of views to bring to you. A view from the inside, the incumbents represented by Jocelyn. A view from the outside, a couple of our startup friends. Oh, and of course I missed Mitch. Sorry, Mitch. So Mitch is the EVP and head of Americas at Cover Genius, where he's responsible for the establishment and growth of the X-Cover platform and the broader Cover Genius business across North America, Canada, and Latin America. And most recently, actually, Mitch was also at Trove. So thank you, Mitch, for joining us. Unfortunately, we do not have Tucson with us today, so I think I will try color commentate for where I think Tucson will have gone, but Tucson's an AVP at Sun Life looking at their analytics program. So I think just sort of further to sort of the welcome, I think this is really about sort of not just the startups integrating with the incumbents, but also how that future of work is changing. So we're going to touch on a few sort of key themes here, I think. One is really around some of the cultural opportunities or challenges of working with startups, as well as then that nature of how the work is delivered, I think is also an important one. A lot of the incumbents are complicated, multi-line businesses, and how do we integrate appropriately? And then finally, we want to talk a little bit about some technology themes, and so we'll kind of just crack on from there. So with that being said, I think we're going to have a few opening comments, first from Jocelyn and then from Phil to kind of kick us off. So I'll invite them to get going.
Great. So I'll start. Good morning, everyone. Pleasure to be with you. It's going to be interesting for me to practice my English in front of a big crowd like that. So I'll share, I would say, 5 points related to my experience of the past 6 years trying to put in place an innovation strategy for a carrier. First comment I would say is probably to link your innovation strategy directly into the strategy of the organization. Because the thing is that there are insurtech everywhere out there. They cover the whole value chain. So if you don't link it strong enough into the strategy, there's a fair risk that you will get lost. And just an example of what we lived 5 years ago when we first started to think about usage-based insurance, we saw it as a way of converging a couple of ideas. First, helping the society in terms of prevention. We saw it also as a way to improve customer experience. And finally, as a way to improve risk segmentation. So having a strong link like that with the strategy, we decided at the time that it was worth investing a couple of millions to learn, even if, as Guy said yesterday, the business model might not be obvious at first. Go anyway and learn along the way. So first message, link it strong with your strategy. Second message, I would say, try to attach your insurtech initiative high enough into the structure of the organization. Because we have to realize that those insurtech initiatives for an incumbent are more risky than the typical internal project you're going to run. It involves an external partner, sometimes new technology, new way to interact with customers, so obviously more risk, and you have to accept the risk to fail. And I remember a couple of years ago, I had to go one day to my CEO to tell him that we screwed up with one initiative and we had to wash $1 million or $2 million. So it's not your best day in the office, but this can happen. And also, second reason to attach it high enough into the organization is to have the right entry door for the insurtech when they want to talk to you. You see, they're usually small firm, and their time and resources are scarce, and so they cannot afford to waste months and months at hoping to get something, and there's a risk out there that I would call, and I'll invent a word here in English, Keegan, the disease of pilot it, which means doing always pilot and never go to market.
That's right.
And this, if you do that, you will threaten your insurtech partner. So, second element I wanted to mention. Third element is probably the profiles you need internally and the team. You need profiles that are able to speak the language of the insurtech. And by that, quite often, I mean you need engineers. I remember 5 or 6 years ago when we did our first initiative, I was the one being front with the insurtech and the telco. And let's say that in my actuarial courses, that's not a language that I had learned. So that was quite uncomfortable and probably not the safest strategy for the organization. So get the right profile, get engineers. Try also to get profiles that are sensitive to the culture of those small firms. You have to pay attention to the level of resources they have, to the speed they need to go. Otherwise, again, you will not have a partner anymore fairly quickly. And finally, my last piece of advice on that point would be, it's probably better to have a dedicated innovation team. It's not a part-time job, because you need to be present out there in the InsurTech ecosystem, but you also need to monitor and follow what you have implemented, how the customer react. And this, then you need to fix and adapt. So it is a full-time job. So just don't underestimate the level of complexity and involvement. Fourth point I would touch is the point of governance and decision-making. InsurTech, they tend to be agile, be able to develop fast. And as I said before, they have scarce resources in terms of human and dollar. So if you don't take this into account, it will just not work, and you will threaten their survival. So in our case, what we did is that we isolated the innovation team outside of the regular PMO type of things, and we made sure that this team, they had a sponsorship spine that allowed fast decision-making. We had, in fact, what I call the 24 hours rules. We had to be able to escalate a point, make the decision within 24 hours, and move on. So, little point there. And finally, the last point I would touch is probably the need to have a constant market watch of the ecosystem, and then bring back the information internally to educate senior management. Because the reality is that you don't have a lot of engineers sitting on the management committee of P&C insurers. So you need to educate and to make them realize how this is an important trend in our industry, and to keep them always on the top of their game on that. So in a nutshell, that's my view.
Thank you, Jocelyn. I think some great insights. Hopefully some of that resonates with the team. I always chuckled that as Guy was kicking us off, that is an element of never confuse innovation with good marketing. And I think we've been guilty of the latter and not the former, perhaps. But on that note, because maybe we'll get a different point of view, Phil, some opening comments.
Sure. Great to be here. Thanks for having me. I was really interested as Jocelyn and I were connected a few weeks ago, or the panel was connected, and we traded some initial thoughts on our perspectives, and Jocelyn shared a view similar to the one he presented, and my view was like, well, if you turn that upside down, that's not totally dissimilar from an InsurTech point of view. Getting to decisions quickly, the resource scarcity, clarity on the decision chain, governance. We were talking earlier at breakfast that it's often a quick in and strong alignment into innovation labs. But innovation labs are often not well connected into the decision structure, into the P&L, and you sort of percolate here for some time and then just stop. And so, in terms of how we clear some of the log jams, both partners being able to get to a decision quickly. Are we going to work together or not? Are our visions aligned or are they not? Are our timelines aligned? These things need to be vetted quickly. But real transparency and clarity on the decision-making process and governance and how you progress a partnership through into a carrier is critical. I thought it might be helpful too, and Mitch and I compared notes, and as Keegan introduced, had worked together previously at Trove, and maybe just stepping back a little bit and presenting sort of an InsurTech's view of the world, and sort of, first of all, sort of how we're seeing the market. Secondly, how InsurTechs are approaching the market, and I think tying back to some of the themes that Jocelyn hit on. Clearly there's a number of macro trends that are happening right now that are fundamentally shifting how we as individuals sort of move and interact with the world and with each other and with our things. That in itself is creating industry or creating market, and then clearly for the purpose of the insurance industry, it's impacting and disrupting, and there's opportunity there as well. There is a whole new set of emerging and dynamic risk that I think we're all trying to figure out, and to a degree it's sort of crystallizing in front of us if we think about autonomous vehicles and how do you price risk on that, to other areas. We're trying to see what this world is going to look like, and then meet that consumer need with solutions, meet them with solutions. In terms of some of the trends, I mean, clearly we see shifts or increasing urban density, so people living closer together in cities. We talked about and heard about yesterday just sort of the rapid advancement of technology, AI and machine learning and IoT, autonomous vehicles and electrification, and all of these things, how they're playing alongside of the first trend. The one that I find perhaps most fascinating is this fundamental change in sort of this ancient human concept of ownership. So the sharing economy and how our world is shifting where that notion of ownership is changing, whether it's homes or vehicles or other things, jobs. There's a fundamental shift in that, and that's the implication, of course, to both long-standing establishments and to products and to offerings is significant. The last, and we heard a lot of these themes as well, is really the onset of the digital consumer. These are made up predominantly of millennials, which are roughly a third of the population now. Their spend is not quite there, but it's growing. It's only growing, and they're having a tremendous influence and impact on the insurance world in terms of products that are meaningful to them, that are flexible, that are digital, and that meet these emerging risks in the way that they're moving through the world. And I think any one of these trends by themselves are very interesting, but the fact that they're all happening at the same time, I think is fascinating, and I think where insurtechs are sort of rushing in to partner or fill or play a part in these different opportunities. So that's sort of how we might be seeing the world. In terms of how insurtechs are approaching the world, there's probably three main buckets that I would look at. So first of all, you see some insurtechs coming in as full stack, and so they're bringing an innovation, they're bringing technology, they're bringing licensing, and they're bringing capital, and they're going in directly as a carrier and competing directly in the space. If you go to the other end of the spectrum, there are insurtechs that are playing purely in a technology space. They're equipping, to Jocelyn, to your point, some part or even a large part of a carrier's ecosystem, or attempting to play in that regard. And then there's something in the middle where insurtechs are playing in sort of an MGA capacity and living in both worlds, bringing technology and innovation, but then partnering with a carrier for the underwriting risk. Branding may vary in those types of situations, but all of those different market strategies, of course, have impact on how insurtechs and incumbents may or I guess even may not work together. Jocelyn touched on a lot of the themes that I think I would have covered in terms of pitfalls and opportunities, and how insurtechs and incumbents could better work together. The decision making, the clarity and governance, and I think really ensuring that that the relationship is structured to be successful, and by that I mean perhaps a couple of things. We talk about having an innovation mindset. Jocelyn talked about some success and failure in that, but innovating in particular in the insurtech space requires us asking a partner to take risk in an industry that's risk adverse. So that could be brand at risk, that could be capital at risk, and often asking them to work in a way that's different from where they traditionally do. I think what we've found and seen, and we're learning collectively as a community, is that a lot of the larger institutions are not structured to work well with that, whether that's a decision making or how they look at capital. And so I think that opportunity, or I think there's significant opportunity in how how incumbents are structured, and how insurtechs are then able to engage and be successful and move through that structure towards a partnership. And I think the last comment I would just make is just I mentioned earlier sort of getting to are we going to do something or not decision quickly. I think just through the process, just clarity and transparency on what methodology are we going to use, how do we make decisions, how do we change. These types of things that typically fall under our governance structure are really critical. I think what happens is there's, as I said earlier, there's initial alignment, a lot of excitement at an innovation level, and then you start to shift into delivery and execution, and things get really challenging. So yeah, those would be my opening comments, Keegan.
You know, I think it's that funny thing, reflecting on that, of needing to drink our own Kool-Aid. By that I mean, everyone wants to talk a good game about being data-driven. We want to have analytics. We want to have predictive X, Y, Z, which is either a spreadsheet or machine learning. I don't know. It's one or all of those things. But equally, that's against a backdrop of commoditization, of changing consumer preference, and a wanting to engage with us differently. I think the escalation conversation is super interesting. I've never met an executive who's like, I won't make a decision. Give me more data, I'll make the decision even faster. But getting to the right person to have that conversation has been the challenge. So maybe with that as a jumping off point, Mitch, well, maybe we start with a bit of a culture conversation. And I think, you know, maybe there's a myth, maybe there's a reality to a culture clash between incumbents and startups, but I'm curious your perspective on that.
Yeah, so having, I guess, worked on the implementation of technologies both on the carrier side and multiple times on the insurtech side, the culture clash, I think, is real. And I think it emerges at a number of different points in the process. I mean, if you look at it from the very beginning, I think the starting point for all of that is actually like, there's not a whole lot of honesty in the conversation between insurtechs and incumbents when they first engage about what they want to do. Like if you think about it, really that is a multi-sided selling process, right? So the insurtech's trying to sell their value to the incumbent, and the incumbent is trying to sell their value to the insurtech, right? Underlying that, I think the fundamental kind of gap that creates a culture conflict is two things. One of them is intent, and the other is incentives. So from an intent perspective, I don't think incumbents and insurtechs are honest with each other about what it is they're actually trying to do. On the insurtech side of things, they are literally a live and organic experiment happening in real time, right? They want to create a real business. They don't necessarily know exactly what that looks like at that point in time. They need to be able to react quickly, look at information, and ultimately create something that's commercially viable. And then on the incumbent side of things, often their main incentive is just to learn about what's going on in the market and think about how that should inform their business strategy. I think those two things are fundamentally misaligned. What the insurtech needs is a level of commitment that can get them to the point of commercial viability quickly, even if the outcome of that is to say, no, this isn't the right thing for us. Whereas the incumbent actually has an incentive to try and drag things out and extract as much value and information out of that relationship as possible. And so the second element of it, the fundamental element that I think kind of creates a culture clash, is the incentives that exist within these two organisations. Insurtechs are incentivized to get a quick and dirty solution to market quickly so that they can find out whether that is actually the right thing to do and if they need to tweak that, which is very much kind of rooted in that lean startup kind of methodology. And then you've got the incumbent who, if you think about how their business is structured, they're all about generating value for shareholders, right? And if you think about how a purely experimental project with an unknowable value outcome sits in the context of a multi-billion-dollar organisation who has a laundry list of projects, all of which are probably quantifiable to the extent that they can deliver over $100 million in value, there's a fundamental issue there that that project will never actually stand up in that forum. And so I think from those two vectors, those two organisations just aren't fundamentally aligned for success. I don't think that is to say that it can't work. So there are a number of circumstances where we have made it work in the past, and we've kind of taken a number of different approaches to that, which has been an attempt to kind of bridge that cultural gap and try and solve some of those problems. One of those approaches is to take kind of like the outside-in approach, which is usually via the innovation team. So you go and you engage with those people in the organisation who are most fundamentally aligned with the way that you view the world. They're most aligned from an incentive perspective with, you know, how you want to make change happen. You use that as a platform to generate a lot of momentum and belief within what it is you want to do, and then you go and you take incremental steps to deliver something. The problem with that approach is that invariably at some point that project becomes a commercialization initiative within an organisation, and it then gets passed off to a whole bunch of people in the business who then are left with this thing that they didn't create, and they need to, they've been told to go and make it successful, and at the same time they're trying to critically evaluate it so that they can manage the expectations of their own stakeholders. That, to me, was the first way that I approached that kind of deployment problem, and it seemed to me at the time that it was a great way because we got so much momentum at the start and it really felt like we'd nailed it. And then down the track, it really started to grate with the organisational culture of the organisation, and we started to slow down, and it really seemed to start to feel like hard work. And that's when you start to run into stage gates and approval processes and governance, and you feel like you're kind of begging for your supper every day when you kind of thought that you had, you know, the approval and the support of the organisation, and it kind of flips all the goodwill on its head. That being said, we did make it work in that scenario. It just felt like it got harder as we went. Another way that we've done it in the past is to actually invert that and seed the idea with the business first rather than go in via the innovation pathway. That kind of operated in exactly the reverse. So there was a whole bunch of selling that had to happen up front with a whole bunch of different stakeholders to get them bought into the idea that we wanted to kind of push forward. But at the end of the day, by kind of allowing those business people to be the first stakeholders, and even though you have to do a lot of legwork up front, once you get those guys bought in, they actually become champions of yours that are actually embedded in the organisation, which to me was a much more powerful way of doing it. Either which way, the commonality between both of those approaches, which ultimately led to success, was in that we had a senior executive who had ultimate decision-making power who basically told both of those teams that they had to go and do it, right? So in the first scenario, he was telling the business people that this has been decided, make it happen. And in the second, he was telling his team, I want this to happen, so you guys have to get on board with this. And even though there's a kind of cultural change element to that and still a lot of kind of building trust and rapport and all that sort of thing, ultimately it was that was the driver. And I truly believe that without that kind of authority and power sitting behind some of these initiatives, you'll never be able to get over the internal incentives that exist that aren't really aligned with what the insurtech is trying to do. There is one other way to circumvent all this, and we've also done this approach in the past, which is to think about the type of insurtech business that you partner with, right? So if you wind back the clock a couple of years when we were first kind of building the on-demand insurance product at Trove, we didn't have a whole lot of insurance expertise, right? So it was important for us to partner with a carrier that had that so that they could help us build that and we could bring that to market. As you kind of develop and internalize a lot of that capability, you don't need a lot of that hand-holding anymore, especially when it relates to products that you've already deployed. And so then we started to make some decisions about, all right, what's the best partner for us? Is it a retail carrier or is it a reinsurance company? Reinsurance companies, well, retail insurers have product development and product management baked into their organizational structures, right? So if you're trying to do something from a product perspective which is very different, you're naturally going to have a lot of engagement from these stakeholders, and you're going to run into a lot of the, you know, this is how we've always done it kind of mentality, which in many circumstances is totally valid. I think the point's been made a number of times yesterday that, you know, one of the challenges for insurtech companies is that there's a lot of technical capability that potentially doesn't exist in technologists that are pure kind of startup guys. So that knowledge is valuable, but it can also slow you down based on the embedded biases. Alternatively, you can work with a reinsurance company who really isn't a product organization. They're capital allocators, essentially, right? So they take less of an interest in a role in the actual product development side of things, and they can afford an insurtech a lot more flexibility in actually bringing something to market. And I found there's less of a cultural clash in that kind of partnership. The only caveat to that is you need to have the capability internally to be able to build a profitable product on your own, which is either a question of going out and learning that through previous partnerships or actually going out and acquiring the right talent to be able to bring that in-house.
Well, hopefully at the same time, not having, what do we call it, pilotitis. Yes, exactly right.
I mean, I think a lot of what's been said is spot on. But if I had to summarize it, sitting from the venture capital perspective and looking at, we've had the privilege of looking at 1,100 investment opportunities in the financial service space in the last 36 months. There is a fundamental difference in pace at which these businesses operate. A fintech, insurtech is in survival mode from day one. They don't know when the next lunch is coming from. And so they're operating at a pace which is very difficult for an incumbent to follow. And a perfect example of this is an insurtech or a fintech gets really excited because they sold into the innovation lab of an incumbent in Canada. And they get really excited, and they do a great job. They demonstrate the value. They really, without a doubt, show that the technology, that innovation clearly differentiates this incumbent from the rest of the marketplace. And yet, once they've done that, and they figure, okay, we're about to sign a commercial contract, they realize that now they have to sell the product again. This time, they have to sell it to the business line. And so as they go through the process of selling to the business line, they get really excited because it's working, and then guess what? They have to sell it again. Now they have to sell it to the legal or regulatory compliance side of the business, and they go at it. And if they survive that, if they're lucky enough to come out the other end looking like what they started, then they have to actually get the IT department to vet the technology. And so effectively what we're doing is we are exciting the ecosystem by providing them the means to go out and display their product through the innovation lab, but then we're killing them off. Because, these startups have 12, 18 months. The founders have left their jobs. They're working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, nonstop. They're struggling. They get this ray of hope by getting into the innovation lab, and then the pace just grinds to a halt. And in one example, we have a portfolio company. I was telling Keegan and the rest of my panel colleagues here earlier, we have a company in our portfolio that spent 20 months selling to the Canadian banks. In the first 3 months, every single Canadian bank put them into their innovation lab. And then in the pursuing 17 months, nothing happened except frustration and spending. At that board meeting, we decided to stop selling to the Canadian banks, not spend one more dollar selling to the Canadian banks. And Lord and behold, in 18 months, they sold to 80 banks around the world, including the UK and the US. And so there is a sense of urgency that exists in other parts of the world that does not exist here in the incumbents. I do feel that it's beginning to change, but it's changing at a pace that's still not satisfactory to sustain this great ecosystem that we're building. And don't kid yourself, we're very, very fortunate in Canada. 15 to 20% of our GDP is financial services. So we have the expertise. We'll put up this expertise against anybody in the world. We know financial services. At the same time, we're churning out engineers from great universities. And we're starting to see them come together. That's why my partner and I have had the pleasure and the privilege of looking at 1,100 investment opportunities in the last 3 years. 1,100 investment opportunities in financial services. The world is changing at a pace that is very rapid. And all you have to do is look at what's happening in the UK and look at what's happening in Singapore and other parts of the world that are leading the way. I was saying earlier as well that it took 100 years to get 5 banking licenses in the UK. And in the last 5 years, there have been over 40 banking licenses granted to challenger banks. The world is changing, and in Canada, from an incumbent perspective, the changes are being somewhat pushed away by a perception of a captive market, and I'm sorry if I'm upsetting anybody in the room, but there's this perception of regulatory protection and captive market. But guess what? The day Amazon starts to bundle financial services with their Prime membership, it's going to really burst that bubble. So if I had one message to send to the incumbents is that if you can, accelerate the pace at which you absorb technology. Because if you don't, you're going to lose your leadership role in the world as a financial service. One of the new key success factors for financial services organization is the ability to absorb technology. And you're so lucky to have such a vibrant ecosystem that you've partly subsidized, frankly. Such a great ecosystem that's developing these arms, these weapons that are going to allow you to become even more competitive globally, and you're not absorbing it fast enough. Instead of having the startup sell 4 or 5 times to the same organization, how about just trying to get him to sell or her to sell once to that organization? Yes or no? Let's get to that decision quickly so that we can decide whether or not we want to, as a startup, continue to devote resources to the process.
It's the classic case of it's not enough to have the design lab where the guy comes in and snips the CEO's tie and hangs it on the wall and we call it a day. You know, that's sort of fake integration, right? But I guess outside of the tie snip, Phil, if you had to pick one early sign of success, if you could, would there be an early sign or the key sign of success?
So specifically around culture.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think and we heard it a bit yesterday, so I'll pretend it's an original thought, but perhaps it's not. You know, I think, you know, from a startup to be successful, you know, spending the time early on to establish and getting clear on what your values are, that then shapes how you approach your product. It shapes how you approach your partnerships and how you define your criteria for vetting. You know, transparency and just sort of the authenticity to do what you're good at, but not try to be what you're not. That might mean bringing in talent to supplant, like Mitch alluded to earlier, with leveraging insurance expertise early days, and if you don't have that internally. But I think you know, having a clarity on your culture, having a leadership that exudes it, and making that. I mean, you know, I think, Guy, you might have referenced Drucker's, you know, culture eats strategy, and you know, if you can lay out whatever strategies you want, but if you're not clear on your values that then shape your culture, that then drive your decision making, I think that would be the single most. And then I think just sort of that transparency and authenticity within the company, then that becomes your outward projection.
Starting with why. I think there's some really fantastic TED Talks on exactly that, but it's something that when you get into those different parts of the business and you end up with the IT view, the regulatory view, the business view, et cetera, their why is informed by 100 years of history. And that's a good thing generally. We've got a well-capitalized, stable marketplace, but one that has to say the way forward to be successful is not what made me successful in the past. We're not just, you know, growing our economy at 20% a year over year. And I think that's the other thing that I'm sure everyone else in the room is seeing, is that as we think globally about how those sort of cultural interlocks have to fit together with international expansion, whether that's the LATAM or Asia particularly, there's a lot of carriers are playing in. The ways of being successful there are different. So I guess I want to shift a little bit to that sort of work conversation. How do I work in those different markets, work with those different players? And maybe, Mayor, because you already got us going with bringing some of those to yes or no quickly, but how do we want to get the right players in the room? Because I think certainly when we think of a P&C or a Life Co, there's a lot of lines of business. There's a very complicated org chart to manage. What's the injection point?
So I wish I knew the answer, but failing that...
I'll make one up. That's okay. We're good.
But failing that, here's how we do it. We really want to make sure that the companies that we support have not only the technical know-how, but also the insurance or financial services know-how. When you put these two together, you have a much better likelihood of success. And the reason for that is that, look, I mean, you look at insurance particularly, and maybe leave aside P&C for a second and really pick on life insurance. I mean, these processes of selling life insurance, the distribution network is just so convoluted. And it's just, there's so much fat in the system, it just begs for disruption. But it hasn't happened. And the main reason it hasn't happened yet is because, you know, the carriers know who butters their bread, right? I mean, the distribution center holds a huge amount of influence on the carriers. If the carriers were to innovate and to circumvent the distribution network to deliver a cheaper, better product to the end customer, but what happens between the time they start that process and the time they actually demonstrate success? They would have pissed off pardon my language, the entire distribution network. And distribution network says, you know what, we're not going to sell your product because you're trying to stab us in the back. And so you need to have somebody that understands the distribution process extremely well. And you need this person to find a team of ambitious, aggressive engineers that together find a way to deliver and to address some of the sensitivities that are not obvious if you don't know the industry. There is a lot of unspoken rules and regulations that make it very difficult to innovate within the insurance space. By the way, insurance incumbents, I'm speaking to you in the room, the financial services industry, especially the banking industry, has understood that these relationships, these special relationships, are not sustainable long term. And as a result, we're seeing an accelerated pace of absorbing innovation, nowhere near where it should be. But if you want to see what the future looks like, spend some time in London, spend some time in Singapore. That's the future. And we're going to get there. We might get there at a slower pace, but that's the direction we're going to. So from the fintech perspective, from the insurtech perspective, bring in some insurance talent that understands the subtleties that are associated with distributing and innovating insurance product. And from the incumbent perspective, for God's sake, shorten the life cycle of the sale. Go from 6 months to 6 weeks. Let's just try that and see how that goes.
It's the case, I think, when we did our last labor force survey, that the average worker in the insurance sector in Canada is 5 years older than the average Canadian worker. And so we think about that. We think about commoditization, changing behaviors, and wanting to shorten those cycles. Is it the case that we can just outlive maybe our distribution network? But because they'll just retire, and that'll be the end of that. But I guess, Jocelyn, is there anything to pick up on? Because I think part of this is about executing at speed, right? Anything to chime in on?
Well, it's funny that when we hired our first engineer, they came with their experience, and they told me, here's the way I work. I work agile and da-da-da. And so I had one question. Do you still deliver at a certain date in spite of that? The answer was yes. So do what you want, but
deliver.
Respect the date. And they were kind of used to work the same way the insurtech do work. So in fact, that has been an important success factor.
Yeah, it's all about that sponsorship. I think, just picking up where Mitch started, right? If you don't have that level of line of sight, you can't get to yes or no, but you're not going to get the project delivery or cost or whatever organized, sorted, approved, et cetera.
But it's important to institutionalize that, right? Because not everybody has access to the CEO and the COO of insurance companies and financial services. So the organization needs to create a mechanism by which they can institutionalize the absorption of new tech, as opposed to hope that they can get to the CEO and the COO.
It's the old edge of build the company and run the company, and how do we oscillate between those two? I guess, Phil, picking up where we were going earlier with the changing of those work practices. Everyone will say agile. We'll come back to that in a minute. My least favorite buzzy word right now. What have you had to change since working with some of the large carriers?
Sure. So a lot of themes I would draw on yesterday. One of the ones that resonated strongly and that we've, I think, touched on here is just sort of the selling cycle. I think, early days and depending where you enter the organization, you pick up a lot of traction quickly, only to realize that the total selling cycle might be a 2 or 3 year process. And so really just sort of, the insurtech mind shift to recognizing that there is a longer selling cycle. You might get synergy and alignment early and quickly and excitement, but to actually get to a commercially viable product, it's going to take some time. I think that's been part of it. Talents and augmenting your talent, I think, is a theme you're hearing here. And I think it might have been Jonathan around the State of the Union panel yesterday, where it was sort of the technology companies will get up to a certain point, the insurtech companies will get up to a certain point working with insurance, but if you don't have insurance, that's sort of a limited shelf life. I think if there's not that ability to then not only understand the insurance need and how the technology applies, but then the delivery into execution and how you operationalize that, the insurtechs without that internal knowledge, I think, can come across a little bit arrogant and a little bit, our tech is the new shiny thing and it's going to solve your problems. So I think there's a balance there. And then I think as Jocelyn said too, I mean, respectfully bringing actuaries to sit with engineers to do innovative product design is often not a very fun conversation either. So on the carrier side, augmenting their resource in a way that's then compatible. It doesn't have to be replication, but of course, bringing a mindset and a methodology. And then I would say, as well, there's a bit of, I think we'll go there in a minute with some of the agile, but there's a little bit of a decoder ring that needs to happen where there's different design and development and delivery methodologies. If you're an agile technology shop that's working in this manner, and you're dealing with the carrier that's used to a waterfall methodology, and you need to find a way to find common ground in language, and you might be able to still execute in your respective methodologies, but I think a lot of times there's friction, and so this has been a learning, I think, as well as I reflect on where we've stumbled and where we found success. I think just sort of trying to understand as clearly as possible early on the decision-making process. I think Mitch talked on some of the methodology and how they deliver. That transparency and authenticity then can allow for some open dialogue and I think more successful execution.
There's a question I think about sort of that medium to long-term horizon that maybe we haven't done successfully as an industry to date. And I guess, Jocelyn, I'll come to it in a second. I find in my conversations it's either show me in-year benefits because I've got an operating plan I need to hit and I want to just bring the snake oil to solve that problem, or it's my 5-year roadmap tells me in 4.5 years I'll have that thing. And so there's this false dichotomy between either being very short-term focused or very long-term focused. And the question is, has long-term thinking changed since having worked with insurtechs? And what does long-term sort of mean to you now?
Yeah. There are those two ideas. First, this short-term delivery pressure and maintenance of the solution and improving it. But then, to me, there's always this question, will you still be there in 5 years, in 10 years? Because if I implement your solution and you disappear, you get your valuation is growing, you decide to sell in something, I need you to still be there. So quite often what the incumbents are doing is that they put some money to secure a bit their insurtech partner and to kind of protect a bit the long-term view. Because this is critical. Once you implement a solution, having to remove this, replace it by something else once it's front to the consumer, quite complicated. So always an important question.
I kind of love this question because to me it's always the case of, no one would generally say, particularly from a VC perspective, oh, insurance is leading the way in technology. But if you go back 30 years when we all implemented PMS or I-90 or Huon, we did lead the way. We just then did nothing for 30 years. It was a bit of a sad reflection. But it requires us to think differently. And I think that conversation about what is long-term and that support of sustainability mean, is it being fed from a legacy point of view of, but I had my system for 30 years, I want to keep that startup for 30 years? Or is it the case that in 3, 5, 6 years from now, actually there'll be a whole new wave of work to be done? And how do I think about agilely ingesting that sort of change along the way? Unresolved questions, I think. But jumping back to that agile conversation, so shifting maybe to sort of our third theme around like technology and where is that moving? Mayor, you saw 1,100 or so. What part of emerging technology do you think is going to have the biggest change?
So in insurance specifically? So I'll preface my comments by starting and saying that technology is not really the complicated part in financial services innovation. The technology has generally been adopted elsewhere, where they're doing real science, like NASA and, self-driving cars at Elon Labs and things like that. That's where technology is truly being built from the ground up. What we're doing in InsurTech and in FinTech is taking parts of these technologies and adopting them to work within the financial service space so that we can enhance the customer experience, improve our risk management. And so when I think about for insurance especially, some of the things that are going to be groundbreaking. Fraud. I mean, fraud monitoring, detection, spotting the fraud before it enters your organization. I don't even know how to begin to value that, but it has a lot of zeros around it. The second thing is trying to lighten the distribution network of insurance product. And the banks have figured out that if they aren't transparent, they're going to get slapped around by the regulators. The insurance companies, even though they're highly regulated, haven't yet figured out how to speak to the customers in a way that their customers understand, which is why we're seeing brands like Lemonade in the US really, at least from a policy perspective, sell a lot of policies because they change the way they're communicating with the customers. So I think anything that will improve the distribution network, that would make the selling of the product more streamlined and clearer so that the customer understands the value that the insurance companies are offering, I think is, any businesses in that area we're looking at very closely. And then I guess the final thing is, I'm wearing an Apple Watch. I was just reading the other day that it's now the best-selling watch in the world, and so we're collecting all this information. And I know that there are some reinsurance companies that are looking at whether or not the data we're collecting on a day-to-day basis when we're walking over our smartphones can actually replace some of the fluid sampling that has to be done to sell life insurance product and other products. And should the correlations hold up as they have so far, I think there's a whole wave of new insurance products that we could sell people. And we could sell them for cheaper, and we can customize the products to the risk tolerance that we're seeing. So those would be the three things in insurance that we're excited about.
It's interesting convergence of those things too, right? If I had that data, how can I manage fraud better? How to then deliver a more personalized customer experience? And I think this is the thing that I always love-hate, admittedly, about guys like Lemonade, is they've had this tremendous growth, and all the insurance people in the room will be like, yeah, but their combined operating ratio is above 100%, so don't worry about it. Yeah, but their renewal rate is amazing. It's beating the market average. So they will get there, right? And they've got the funding. It's the same thing with, I think it's Spotify that loses $30 million a month.
Amazon. Look, I remember sitting on the trading desk with Amazon 20 years ago, and I heard that argument exactly.
Yeah.
And they only started making money recently.
Yeah.
Right?
So it'll get there if there's enough of that consumer buy-in, right? I guess the question about Agile, Phil, is really around, is it Wagile? Is it Higile? Is it just waterfall with different logos? Should I have invested in 3 and Post-it notes? What are your thoughts? I guess my question is really, do you think the carriers can do it? Because my hypothesis is they're not set up to do it.
Yeah, I mean...
That's a no.
Yeah, no, I wasn't going to answer that one. So I think from a delivery methodology, Agile on the product, on the technical product delivery, works well. We've made some changes recently internally, not too far away from Agile, we have been, but in how we structure it. I think where the challenge enters is sort of back to some of my comment earlier, is really bridging the two worlds together. Software delivery is one thing, and frankly, I think you can, within reason, sort of compartmentalize that in whatever methodology you want to use. The challenge then becomes understanding what the carrier's expectation for delivery is. Is it a hard schedule? Is it whatever it might be, and trying to map the one to the other, because they often don't map very well. And it becomes a very awkward conversation where you're getting very structured questions, and your answers are not soft, but just not as specific as the question. So I mean, I think the carriers we're starting to see, more of them, or more of the incumbents, if not embrace, at least understand the delivery methodology, and that's certainly making the conversations easier. I don't know that I would profess that they need to switch themselves to that, although from a solution delivery perspective, there needs to be some greater common ground and compatibility between the two delivery life cycle, or two methodologies.
Just to add to that, so I think that is symptomatic or reflective of that clash in incentives and objectives, right? So the incumbent, their goal is to crystallize value within a certain time frame. And to be honest, I don't think Agile necessarily is the right methodology for that goal, because it is opaque on delivery. It may be the most effective at proving a hypothesis and building an experimental technology. But I mean, do those things actually align? Like, I'm not super sure of that, to be honest.
I think the thing that I wanted to hit on, this is where I love, is that Agile's come to mean how I do work as opposed to how I deliver a product. And I think that sort of the technical delivery, there's a lot of positive attributes that you can put it in a little innovation lab. Yeah. You can surround it with the right people to have that proof of concept quickly delivered. But then we expect that 40-year seasoned underwriters are going to all of a sudden underwrite in an Agile way. I'm not really sure that's going to work, and I don't know that those incentives are lined up that way, and in fact, maybe that's not the way to do it. But what I think we're trying to get at from an incumbent perspective, I don't know, Jocelyn, anything to add on this, but is that we want to be more responsive to the market. I think that's what we're trying to, maybe a better word is nimble, which is difficult when you're a 100-year-old institution.
Well, I don't think you need to turn the whole company development process into Agile. You need to embrace this for that small portion there of innovation where you interact with the InsurTech, but it would be a bit, I think, too ambitious to try too fast to turn the whole company. At least that's my experience, and it's quite feasible.
That's exactly right. I think it sort of reminds me that it's about the waves of management maturity to understand how to apply those best of breed practices. Years ago it was I want to have telecommuting, right? I want to be able to have a mobile phone, and then I want to have remote working, and now we can literally walk around with any of our devices anywhere. And we've had to adjust our management practices. So maybe this is just the next evolution of as the new millennials are entering the marketplace, as we've got InsurTechs challenging our ways of working, we need to again sort of evolve our management practice to sort of sort that out.
Yeah, Keegan, I think if I pull sort of these two views together, I think, to me the methodology for development and delivery is perhaps a symptom of a different challenge, and I think, Mitch said it well, just that, the objective of a lot of the carriers is to know when a product's going to be in market and when it's going to be profitable. And so there's, I think, an understanding that new product introduction may take some time to establish itself, both from a customer base, from a performance perspective, but from an innovation perspective, this is where the Agile comes in, and it's not sort of the shoulder shrug, like, I don't know, but I think there's a recognition that, when you're getting an MVP to market quickly, when you're learning and applying those learnings and iterating, that getting to clarity on a traditional profitability timeline, I think, so the delivery methodology becomes the point of debate, but I think, back to my sort of opening comments around that innovation mindset, I think it's the carrier or the incumbent embracing that, hey, listen, this might take a couple years to be profitable, and I'm gonna create a structure around it that doesn't operationalize it or pull it into a P&L too quickly. Not that it doesn't have to be accountable to a P&L, but as soon as you pull it into your core structure and the P&L takes over, then you start to, and Mitch made a comment, a different scenario, I think, where somebody sort of inherits it, but when it moves into your traditional operation and it's not ready yet, I think then the delivery methodologies start to come in question, and I think that's where a lot of the friction arises.
Totally agree with what Phil said. That's what I lived in the past couple of years. We made the choice that you described.
Yeah.
And it's an interesting conversation, because the trade-off is the incumbents have this incredible credibility on the part of the customers. They have a brand that is trusted. The newcomers have basically no brand, but they have a technology that the customer wants. And there is a period here of incredible vulnerability for the incumbents, because you could build a brand over time. Yes, it's expensive. Yes, it's messy, but we've seen it. Wealthsimple is an example of that, and I can point to many, many other examples where eventually you can build that credibility. From a incumbent perspective, the source code that represents the backbone of the network is only getting older and more tired and more difficult to innovate from. And so while it's not obvious right now, if you extrapolate this into the future, the products that a nimble innovator, which now has a reasonably good brand, can bring to the table are way more interesting for the customer or more in line with the customer needs than what the incumbent can do. So eventually, the incumbents have to have a plan to replace that backbone, and it's messy, and it's expensive, and it's scary. But it's time for the incumbents to take risks in terms of how they do things, because I think if they don't, they're going to find that the next 20 years are going to be very, very challenging, especially if they have to speak in terms of shareholder return, which eventually becomes linked to how quickly you can develop product, how quickly you can bring product to market, and how relevant is that product once it hits the marketplace. So,
The democratization of that technology has continued to shape the landscape, right?
Yeah.
It used to be the case that only the big guys could afford it, and now that's not the case.
Oh, you got me.
Yeah.
I have to say something. My brother had a startup in 2001, and he spent, so he raised $1.5 million, of which $1.2 million went into a bunch of servers that he had to put in a room that he had to get. The cost of failure for startups has gone way down, because today, you can start a business and host everything on AWS for $35.99 a month. Very different than that $1.2 million that he spent, right? So the cost of failure has come down. So these innovators are not going anywhere. They're going to keep chipping away at it because the cost of failing has come down.
Yeah, exactly right. I suppose maybe, Mitch, because I know this is a ranty point for both of us, is going to be really a question around, we see this sort of like chipping away at the ecosystem. Why aren't we seeing more insurtechs go full stack, full throttle at the whole thing? I know you got some thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I would kind of turn that question around and go, why would a technology company ever want to go full stack, I think is the question, right? So if you look at, and I think you need to kind of analyze the role that technology actually plays within a financial services context. So if you look at all the incumbent insurance companies or even, you know, broader financial institutions, they kind of all created in the old industrial mold, right? Which was like, you see a market opportunity and you need to actually forge a path through all the activities that will take you from capital all the way to distributing a product. So they all own the balance sheet, they all manufacture the product, and to a certain extent, they own the distribution mechanism for that product, whether it's under their own brand or through another channel, right? They did that because it was very, very expensive to do it any other way back under the old model. And so it was a very capital intensive way to do it, but it was the only way to do it. And when you actually executed on it, you had a very large moat that surrounded your business, and therefore you could extract a whole bunch of value from that. What technology actually enables, and like the proliferation of faster computing power, is it actually lowers the transaction cost between each of those activities in that value chain. And what that does is it actually breaks it up. And it allows people from outside to come in and actually start focusing in on individual activities in that value chain and becoming actually much, much better at them, right? So that is the reason why the existing industry is threatened by technology, because by virtue of the fact that they had to create that full value chain, they don't actually exist as the best of breed in any of those activities. And so I think what the incumbents have to do now is actually really be honest with themselves around like, what is our actual competitive advantage in that value chain? I would argue that it's probably more skewed towards capital management, risk management, and licensing than it is towards customer experience and that sort of like product. Well, product development probably is in the middle somewhere. And so then I would ask the question: why would an insurtech want to create themselves in that old mold if all it's going to do is mean that they're limiting their ability to compete at full power in the thing that they probably are the best at, right? And then, as an insurtech company, I'm like, if I've got a limited amount of time and resource to go and solve a problem and build a really big business, there's higher ROI things for me to be allocating my capital to than putting money behind a balance sheet to go and become an insurance company. I have to actually put capital aside to manage that. I have to create a whole bunch of compliance capability and activities to also enable that to happen. I just think that's a misuse of capital from an insurtech's perspective, unless they've got product market fit and they're really turning over a whole bunch of cash. There are examples where I think some companies have to take a different approach. And I think kind of to Phil's point before, that's when you're doing something so different that you can't actually get access to capital for that without actually putting it to risk yourself, right? And so some insurtech companies are out there creating products that are so fundamentally different and innovative that no capital provider out there would be willing to stake them for long enough for them to be able to prove their hypothesis and bring it to market. And even in that scenario, there's ways around that, right? So like you could argue that if that's really what you were trying to do, then maybe you could go and source alternate sources of capital, or you could even go to an innovative carrier and go, why don't you guys invest in me and give me a bunch of money, and then you create alignment of incentives at that point whereby they'll want to actually stake you through to the final outcome rather than pull it apart after 12 or 18 months. So I think there's that argument to it. And then if you think purely from like an economic perspective, becoming a full stack insurance company, I think potentially limits your options when it comes to exiting your business or building out your full scale strategy over time. So whether this is the right way to look at it or not, I think, some people in the market will tell you that technology companies have higher multiples than fully regulated insurance companies. I think that's generally observable when you look at public market stats. I also think that the less regulation you can bake into your business at the outset gives you more flexibility in finding potential acquirers and partners down the track. I think the reality for any kind of startup in the fintech or insurtech space is it's not like WhatsApp, right, where Mark Zuckerberg's going to come and take you out to dinner and write a number on a napkin and push it over the table, right? If someone's going to come in and buy your business and you're in a regulated market, especially if they are a regulated entity, you're going to get DD like you've never seen before, right? It's not just this year, we're going to buy your company today, here's a big chunk of money, right? So adding regulation and complexity and a whole bunch of other stakeholders to your business only makes that process more difficult and potentially limits your strategic options. And so I would question, like if any insurtech company, if I was to invest in one and they wanted to be full stack, I'd be very specifically asking them why they wanted to do that and how that decision was actually enabling them getting to their outcome, rather than just doing it because they think it's a business model.
Thankfully, there's so much fact that's embedded within these organizations right now that there's plenty of opportunities to just help them get better internally.
It comes back to that integration, instead of our kicking off point. How is it that we've got this sort of mass democratization of technology where we're able to then have those best of breed, but still, as generally the incumbents, we struggle to externalize access or to integrate different ways? And I'm always reminded of that sort of, again, that industrial model cycle, which was mass market generalization, because I've got a new thing and I can just harvest value out of that. We then went through a conversation about, well, specialization drives more productivity. That's true. When I actually don't have the technology to route the work appropriately. We've now come out the other side of that, not just recently, like 15 years ago. But we still have highly specialized teams focused on one thing, which just increases our keep the lights on cost, which is very complicated. And so I think you're spot on about that. The fat in the system is that I could solve that problem a bunch of different ways. Don't require 20 dedicated teams doing that one niche thing on a full moon Sunday, once every 3 months. Anyway. I know we're just at sort of time now for some questions, if there are any. I think there's some runners in the audience for some mics. We've got sort of a few minutes to take any. If there's anything that people have been burning away jealously on their minds, ask our esteemed panel. We should have sprayed you with Red Bull coming into the auditorium. No? Someone, please, has got to be. Nothing. It's so overwhelmingly obvious. I can keep going. No? I suppose that maybe that'll be my question to the panel. We can kind of go through then. Where would you put your money? Smart money. Where'd you put it? What part of the value chain? It's a self-biased question because they're already deep in a bunch of places. But I'm curious for the audience's benefit to know.
I'd say 2 places. I think one is in the embedding the distribution of financial services products elsewhere than through their primary distribution channels that exist today. I think that's essentially what technology can enable. I think there's other places and companies in the world that are probably better suited to selling those things than traditional distribution mechanisms. And that's kind of what we do at Cover Genius. And then I'd say the other part is service provision into the existing industry. So people that actually have better technology for doing things that are known to be of value to banks and to insurance companies. That's what the disaggregation of the value chain actually enables, and I think that's where external parties can come in and add value quite quickly.
Maybe I'll jump to Jocelyn.
Being we're an industry of data, so I think I would bet on the data AI piece.
I had to chuckle. I was hosting a panel 6 months or so ago, and we were talking about autonomous cars and Uber piloting those in San Francisco. And my client I had up with me as an actuary, an analytics guy by background, and I sort of, the hypothesis was, or the use case was, if it rolled up with the driver still in the car, but it's an autonomous vehicle, it's new, would you get in? And of course the actuary goes, I think I need to see more data. But I thought that was well put. In the sense that, you know, one, that will happen, but two, it's here now, and people are taking advantage of those things. So it's sort of incumbent on us, pun intended, to engage with that. Phil or Mayor, thoughts?
You want to go first?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think I'd probably hedge a little bit in that, you know.
Does that mean you're going to invest in an incumbent insurance company?
Both. If I see what's happening right now and just sort of the onset of the digital consumer, the shifts that we talked about earlier, and I think the struggle that I've seen and had with incumbents through conversation is in the near term finding ways to be relevant to this emerging consumer base, and so finding products that are meaningful to them, that move with them, and that's across different business lines. And so, you know, I think sort of early days investment in the ability to get products to market quickly that are digital and relevant and innovative. I think the hedge is that, you know, over time, and I think Keegan, you mentioned it, you know, there becomes a degree of commoditization to innovative products where, you know, if you look at the core elements of them, and I'm not talking even about the policy side of it, but just actually the technical side of it, they all have similarities. I spent a long time at HP, and the reality is if you open up an HP and a Dell, they're not that different inside, right? And so there becomes a degree of that, and so over time, I think, you know, maybe to borrow a little bit by Jocelyn, and you look at the opportunity that we saw some numbers yesterday in terms of the intelligence that we can learn from and that we can serve up and better service areas like claims and some of the other back-end side of the operation that are very costly, that are very human intensive, and as we continue to learn. So that's sort of my pincer, is that I think, you know, in the near term, finding products and capturing the customer base, because I think one of the concerns though too is if we don't capture these customers now, then 5 years from now, when they maybe do buy a car, you know, where's that relationship? And so, you know, even finding, you know, early tendrils to them from a relationship perspective in a product that's meaningful, I think is important in the near term. In the long term, though, I think, you know, being able to process this, you know, tremendous amount of data that we're seeing and apply it to operational efficiency or other forms of innovation.
Keegan, can I ask the room a question?
Of course, please. We're all ears.
How many of you prefer going into the bank to pay your Bell or Rogers bill as opposed to paying it on your mobile phone? In a show of hands, how many of you prefer doing it with your mobile phone versus going to the teller? Mobile phone? Yeah, so we're investing in distribution. We want to make sure that insurance companies have the ability to sell insurance the same way that customers interact with their banks via their mobile phone today. For that, we have to simplify the insurance product in a way that is self-serve by the customer. And I believe we've identified several candidates for that. The second area that I think really benefits is just like self-driving cars analyze a ton of data about the roads and about the climate and about things like that. There is a value in three-dimensional knowledge of who your customer is before you sell that customer a product. And by that I mean an analysis of the credit, which is what we all do, but also an analysis of the social behavior of the customer on all the public sites that that customer is on. And finally, whatever you could find in terms of criminal record and things like that. And all of that done before you even engage the customer in terms of selling that customer a product. So if you can gatekeep and only allow customers into the organization that have been cleared by these 3 dimensions, you can actually lower your cost of insurance because you'll lower your risk. And as a result, you could be very competitive in the marketplace. So we're looking for those gatekeepers. And we also believe we've identified a few of those.
My first observation is anyone who didn't put up their hand is a liar. There's literally
sleeping,
no
or
way
sleeping.
exactly that you're going into a branch to pay a Rogers bill. I'll just do a quick sanity check. Any questions from the audience? Because otherwise I've got one last question for the panel. Please, thank you. Anybody? Oh,
After the break, we're going to have a regulatory roundtable. So from your perspective, what you could influence the way, after the, here we go. So after the break, we're going to have a regulatory roundtable. So from your perspective, if you could influence how the industry, the insurance industry is regulated, what changes would you like to see that would allow insurers to be innovative while at the same time respecting the role of regulators to look out for the interests of consumers?
so just quickly to recap, what regulatory change would we advocate for, while at the same time trying not to say we don't need regulation, because of course. My anecdote to kick off would probably be, I think it's amazing we had a hackathon to develop digital pink slips. Come on. That's my opening thought. Who wants to go first?
I'll go. So having kind of grown up in Australia where the regulatory system is very different, their kind of approach to it is they regulate insurance companies and things like capital adequacy and all that sort of stuff. And they have consumer regulation, which basically enforces companies to do the right thing by the customer. And you're basically left to operate under those assumptions until you don't, and then you basically get smacked, right? Whereas moving to the USA and trying to launch products there, the regulators there, notwithstanding the fact that there's 50 of them, they regulate product, which I think is not very amenable to innovation coming from outside the industry. So you have to craft a product and you have to do it within a certain framework and you have to get it approved, and then once it's in market, it's very rigidly monitored, which I think is very bad for creating flexibility and giving people the freedom to actually experiment. I would love to see the similar kind of model to what they have in Australia, and the UK is kind of similar to that too, where there's a little bit where the interests of the customer are protected very, very rigidly, and the kind of systemic viability of the insurance company is regulated very rigidly, and then you're kind of left to do whatever is in the best interest of both of those parties, as long as you actually deliver on that. I'd like to see that kind of environment kind of all over the place.
I mean, it's a very astute question. You know, the way the regulators have responded is they've created a lot of gray area, right? They're like, yeah, well, we're not going to say no, but we're not going to say yes. And startups are inherently very high-risk businesses. And so to the extent that the regulator could have a seat at the table earlier on and help guide them through that gray zone would be an incredible gift to the ecosystem. And some of them are doing it. I actually think that the regulators have moved in a way even faster than the incumbents.
Phil or Jocelyn, final thoughts?
Yeah, I would say two things. I think that was really well said. I think basically sort of the pace or the speed of regulatory change, and Mitch, I think, brings a different perspective of a product versus a carrier focus. But I think just the ability to, in order to innovate, and particularly where it's not within the current regulatory, being able to move through that process a little more efficiently would be significant. And I think the other one, obviously speaking to a Canadian audience, but in the US as well, is it would be lovely if there was greater commonality across jurisdictions or provinces or states, knocking on every state's door for the same regulatory approval for the same product is is an owner's task, and the same is true in Canada. So if we could get through the process a little quicker, perhaps by being at the table sooner, and then find greater commonality across the geography, that would be a wish.
Yeah, Phil, Mitch, you brought some interesting example from abroad, but I think here in Canada we have example also that works well. And look at AMF in Quebec. They take care of market conduct at the right level, and they take care of solvency of company, and they let a kind of fairly open playing field for the product and pricing. And so I would advocate for more AMF across Canada.
There we go, on the back of a Quebec provincial election. There we go. I think unless there's any other questions, we're pretty much at time. In which case, I'll just say thank you very much to the panelists, Jocelyn, Phil, Mitch, and Mayor, sorry, I was going to say MR, Mayor, for attending. Hopefully that was interesting. I think it's a topic that we could talk on and on and on about, but I know we're staying between you and a break now, so thank you to everybody. Also, thank you to the event staff for all the wonderful gizmometry that we've got, mics and so on, and obviously, thank you for the one question. We'll give you a high five later. Awesome. Thank you so much, everybody.